on Pro Track Creations. Today we're going to be looking at warping audio essentials. So let me just go straight to it and share my screen so we can get going, because it's quite a long lesson, this one, and there's a lot to take in. So warping audio. So today we're going to be looking at warping, time warping samples, transients and pseudo warp markers, using warp markers for different types of audio, such as audio loops, vinyl recordings and full tracks. We're going to be looking at quantizing audio, and finally we're going to be looking at adjusting for good stretching quality using Live's warp modes. So there's many powerful manipulations that arise from Live's warping capabilities. Warping means changing the speed of sample playback independently from the pitch so as to match the song's tempo. The tempo can be adjusted on the fly in the control bar's tempo field up here. So I'm going to just turn it up to 125. So the most elementary use of this technique, and one that usually requires no manual setup, is synchronizing sample loops to the chosen tempo. So Live's auto warp algorithm usually makes it easy to line up samples with the song's tempo, such as a recording of like an out of time band's performance. So you can get it in time. Like if you got a recording that's like a little bit like not been recorded to a click and it's a little bit out of time, you can actually warp it and get it in time with your project to fit it in with your loops. And you get this a lot in like drum and bass and stuff like that. So it's also possible to radically change the sonic signature of a sound using extreme warp settings, so you can manipulate the audio to create some really interesting stuff. So time warping samples. So Live's ability to play any sample in sync with the chosen tempo is a unique and important feature. In addition, you can warp the rhythmic flow of a piece, changing its feel or even move notes to other meter positions. So let's have a look at an audio loop's properties in the clips. Let's drag in an audio loop here. And then if we double click on the audio loop, you can see that you've got the audio clips warping properties over here. So this is in this little sample box, which is a subsection of the clip view. This whole section here is called the clip view. So the most significant control here is the warp switch, which toggles the audio clips warping on and off. That's off, and then that's on. And you can see where I've turned it off, now the actual loop is not fitting in with the project, so you can see that it's not syncing up like that. So what I'd have to do is I'm just going to drag it back in again, so you can see with auto warp switched on, it drags it in, and you can see it's lining up here with the project's grid. Whereas if I turn it off, it's what it's doing, it's playing the loop at its original tempo, which isn't the actual same tempo as we've got in Ableton. But you can set this in Live preferences. So if I go to Live's preferences, you can see in the record warp thing here, I've got loop warp short sample set to auto. So every time I drag in a small little audio loop, a little short loop, some beats or some bass or whatever, it's going to automatically warp it to go in time with your project, which is really useful. So yeah, as I was saying, when you turn the warp switch off, it plays the sample its original tempo, irrespective of Live's current tempo up here. So I mean, this is useful for some types of sample, things that don't have any inherent rhythmic structure, things like percussion hits, atmosphere, sound effects, spoken word and the like. So if I dragged in, let's go for a little single hit here, and let me just drag in a clap like this, like that. So you can see you don't need a warp on to warp a clap sound, because it's just going to play it once, it's not going to loop around. So you can warp it on, but it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need it straight away. So let's just remove that for a second. So yeah, as you can hear with this, if I just loop it, so I'm going to hit select the loop and hit Command L, and then put the metronome on. This loop is going to play in time with the project, which is 125. I'll just turn down the metronome a little bit because it's quite loud. So if you look on this audio file, the actual tempo that it's saying on the file is 127, where we've got it set to 125. So it's automatically getting it in time with your project, or getting it in sync with your current song tempo. So yeah, just go back to the preferences again. I just want to show you a couple of other things on the warping settings. So the other thing is, in the record warp launch settings, you've got this a couple of other settings that you can look at. You've got this auto warp long sample switched on. So that is if you're dragging in like a full track, it's going to warp it automatically for you. This can be useful sometimes, but then sometimes it doesn't quite like work out the warping settings properly. So we'll have a look at that in a bit. And then you've got these default warp modes here, which we're going to be looking at shortly as well. So let's have a look at creating warp markers. So if you look down here, you've got all these transients here, these little transients, and see this yellow thing, this is a warp marker. So if you double click on each one of those, it creates a warp marker, and you can create one anywhere you want. You can just double click anywhere in the file to create a warp marker. So when you're working with your clip, you can have live to scroll the sample playback. Sorry, you can have live to scroll the sample to follow the playback. So if you see here, the sample, you can't actually see what's going on after this section here. It's stopping. So if you just quick click this follow button at the top here, it should play along and then follow along the sample while you're playing. This could be quite useful, so you can easily work out where you are when you stop the track. And sometimes it's useful to do something like this. You can resize the track. If yours is looking like that, when you're doing this sort of work, it's quite nice to have a bit of a better view of the audio clip sample here. So you can resize it just by dragging here. So let's have a look at the transients. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here. So like when you first load a sample into Live, Live automatically analyzes the audio and finds its transients. So let me just turn the metronome off. So we've got the drum loop in there. I've got this full drum loop. But if I drag in some hats here, if I just drag that audio loop in here, and you can see that it's automatically finding the transients. Now the transients are where the sort of loudest part of each hit of the sound are appearing here. You can see it's like automatically working out where each individual hit is on this drum loop. Well, hat loop. And you can see each one of these hits has got this pseudo warp marker. So what it's doing, it's putting these points in the audio where notes or events begin, and they're usually good places to put warp markers. These are good places if you're going to start warping to start from, because Ableton's already done the analysing for you to find the bits that are going to be useful to sort of start moving things around. Yeah, and as I was saying before, these little grey little markers here, they're called pseudo warp markers. So as you hover your mouse across them, these temporary pseudo warp markers appear. So these have the same shape as regular warp markers, but they're grey. You can see like they're grey there. So as I was saying, you double click on one of those to actually create a warp marker. So another thing you can do is you can create these warp markers at the adjacent transients. So what this is quite useful for is if you just wanted to move this sound here. So if I just drag this one here, you can see it's moving the whole sample across. So this can be a bit problematic. So let's play this drum beat. Select it on here. If I select this drum beat, let's just take off some of these ones here. If I click on like one of these warp markers here and then just drag it across, it's gonna like make the whole loop go a bit out of time. So sometimes you might just want to move something like a hit here just slightly more in time. You see that one's a little bit off there. You might want to move that so it lines up with this section here. So to do that, what you can do is if you just hold down the command button and then select the just hover over the pseudo warp marker and then double click, you see it makes like 3 warp markers here. Now this allows you to move this sample around without affecting the rest of the loop. Now, this is quite useful if you just want to get that one a bit like more tightened up there, and then it won't start pushing the rest of the loop out of time. So this is really useful when you're starting to get like creative with dragging in some old sort of like drum loops that you want to might try and manipulate and get them in time. So once you've made this warp marker, you can actually move the waveform beneath the marker. So let's just look here. So we see you've got this waveform here. This is like your waveform here. If you want to move that waveform across a little bit and to get it more in like in time with this marker, at the moment it's picked it up pretty well here. You can see it's like pretty bang on, but sometimes they don't go quite bang on. So You hold down the shift button while dragging the warp marker, and then that's what that's going to do. It's going to move the waveform beneath the marker rather than the marker itself. So let's just do that. Can you see that? It's just moving the waveform. So this can be sometimes good if you just want to get the first bit of the audio in time. So you can also select a range of time and create warp markers at all of the transients. So this is like a, what's it? It's a little 2-bar loop or something like that. Might be a few more than that actually. Might be like a 4-bar loop, but anyway, what you could do, you could think, okay, maybe I wanted to sort of like just put warp markers all in this section like that. So what you could do is you select the section first by just dragging across there, and then you can right click and you can go insert warp markers, and it's going to put warp markers in on all of those transients that are in between that section. But if there's no transients within your time selection, then what happens is you'll get a warp marker put at the beginning and at the end, on the first and the last end of this selection. And although that Live usually does do a good job at placing transients in the right places, you can delete and create transients as well. So, I mean, you could do that in the same menu. So if this transient wasn't like in the right place, you could right click and go delete transient, and then you could then go in and think, okay, where's the bit that I want to put the warp marker in, and then you can manually sort of select it in like that. So that could be quite a useful little trick. So let's have a look at using warp markers. So in the following sections, we look at a couple of applications for time warping samples. So warping is of course an optional property of the clips. So as I was saying, you can sync straight loops. So when you import a sample that represents a well-cut musical loop of 1, 2, 4, 8 bars of length, Live usually makes the correct assumptions to play that loop in sync with the chosen tempo, which we've looked at here. And like when you drag in a new loop, let me just get rid of this one for a sec. I drag in this hats 2 like that. What it does, it creates a warp marker at the beginning and then a warp marker at the end. So if we look at the segment BPM section down here, it says 127 BPM. What that's doing, it's making a guess of the actual original audio's tempo. But you could also type it in here if you wanted to. If it wasn't quite right, you could type it in here, because sometimes it does guess it quite wrong. Not necessarily so much in house and techno, but sometimes if you're doing like trap music where some of the beats are programmed like using halftime, then it might show up at half the BPM. So then what you'd have to do is, if it say like it was a one, you knew that the track that you was making, or the style of music you was making is usually around 140 BPM, and you drag in a sample and it said 70 BPM, you could just double tap in here and then you could retype it in, and like it will get it to the right tempo. Or you can actually use these two buttons here. You've got the ×2 button. So that's going to play it at half time. Let's just solo that. Let's put the tempo on that. So that's doubling it, sort of making it slower. And that's like reducing it. And it's making it faster. So it's putting more in there. So yeah, you could use that. You can see the tempo changing here automatically. So that's like timesing it by 2, that's dividing it by 2. So rather than typing it in, you could press that button. It's just a quicker way of doing it, but it achieves the same result. So another thing you can do is you can time stretch in the arrangement to fine tune the sample. So let me just turn off the warp settings on here and then turn them back on again. Let's have a look at that. So at the moment you can see it's not quite got it to the right size here. Like we've got this 127 BPM like loop here, and it's not quite in the right. It's not warped automatically because I've turned it on and off. It's saying it's 125 BPM here, but we know because we've just looked at it, it's 127 BPM, so it's slightly thrown it off. So there's two ways of doing it here. You could adjust the slider in here like that to get it back in the right time, and then all you got to do is just drag the bit out like that, and then that's going to get it in the right sort of speed. Or the other way of doing it is if you drag in a sample and it hasn't got warp on and you need to get it to the right tempo to fit it in there, to warp it to the right tempo of the project, hold down shift and then you can just drag the project like that and then it gets it in time. So a few handy little shortcuts when you're working with audio. So the other thing you can do is you can sync uncut loops from like vinyl recordings and stuff like that. So when you're importing a loop that's not been edited well into a well-cut loop, Live will play it out of sync. So suppose there's a portion of silence at the beginning, or like the beginning to the first beat. This could cause a few problems getting it in time. So I've got an old bit of vinyl that I recorded ages ago. Let me just find it for you. It's going to be quite quiet compared to the rest. Let me just take these ones off. So let's drag this in and see what happens. So let me just zoom in a bit closer on this one. It's not done it because I think what I did before. Oh no, there it is. Sorry, what I did before. I did this on another project while I was teaching in a course, and it's remembered the settings that I used before. So what happens is when you drag in like a vinyl recording, obviously, like sometimes when you're recording it, you get this gap at the beginning. But where I've got this auto warp settings on, it's put a warp marker in there automatically. So if I turn the warp off and then turn it back on again, like you can see now, it's put the warp marker here at the beginning because it thinks this is the first bit of the audio. But obviously that's not going to line up with like your project. That's not your beat one. That is just a bit of a gap in between there for when you've recorded it. So there's a couple of ways to do this. So you can place a warp marker at the beginning of the audio here. So you could go in here and then you could put a warp marker in here. And then what you could do is you can drag that back to here. So you'd have to delete this one first. And then you could just drag that back to bar 1. And then now that's going to start at bar 1. And it's going to start in time with like your project's like bars here. So it's going to get it in time. Well, not straight in time, but it's going to play from the beginning. Let's go back in here. Let me just zoom in again like that. So now you've got this in, you can actually manipulate this groove. So you can now create any number of warp markers by double clicking them within the clip or the transient locations. So we've got the loop in like that, and you can see you can like create these, like you set a few warp markers here to move them around. We've had a quick look at that, so you can do that. You can move the warp markers around, so you can create some interesting sort of stuff there. So warp markers really serve two purposes. They provide a correct interpretation. They provide a correct interpretation of the flow of musical time in the sample, and they're also there to mess up the flow of the time in the sample. So you can sort of get quite creative with the drum loops, or any loops really, audio loops, any audio loops. This could be vocals, could be bass. So if a single event in a percussive audio loops come late, you could just pin a warp marker in, like I showed you in earlier here. You can see you can just pin a warp marker in, and you can just put that in time. So let's have a look at it again on this vinyl recording. So at the moment, you can see if we're doing it like one by one, you can see that this warp marker is not lining up with the grid. And you can hear it's sounding, it's drifting out more and more because the recording's sort of drifting as it goes along. So what you can do is you could manually go through it, and you could go through each one and like double click, put a warp marker in, and then move it to each like section on the grid that lines up. So go like that. That one's not right, so you could do that. You could do that. You could go through each one, and you can like move them around to try and get it. You think let's just make a little 2-bar loop of this just to sort of demonstrate. I'll hit Command L on there. So you can see that sounding a bit better. But again, some of these hats you could like go in, you can really tighten it up by just going in and getting these in time. Now this is probably more useful when you're using like vinyl recordings, just to get it in time. If you want to just take a section out of a vinyl track to sort of use as a sample, you could just like go through and do it that way, because you probably wouldn't want to use the whole track. It could be a 1-bar loop, it could be a 2, 4, but you can also like sync like entire tracks. So this is quite good if you want to use it for like DJing purposes. So let me just mute this one out, and then what I'm going to do is I've got this full track here. Now if I drag this in now, because I've got auto warp long sample switched on, it should automatically warp this to fit the tempo of the track. Sorry, tempo of the project. So it's saying the BPM is 128. See, the BPM of our project is 125. So let's play it and see how well it's matched it up. Let's just drop the level down a bit. Spot on. If you flick through, it's pretty good. It's matched it all the way through. You can see from here in the clip view, it's put a warp marker right on the very first beat. Even though there's a little bit of a silence before it, it's found the first beat, it's put that on bar 1 automatically, and it's synced up the whole track. So this is really useful if you're trying to put together a live set of pre-recorded like tracks that you might be doing, because it just saves you sort of a hell of a lot of time. And this is also the same as if you do it in session view. You can actually import them into your session view. I've imported it into the arrangement view, but if you're doing a live set, you might want to like drag it into your session view. And again, you could just drag it into a session view slot, and it's going to do exactly the same. So it's a really cool feature of Ableton, and I've not found anything else that does it quite as well, to be fair. So yeah, again, we'll go back to this section. I'm just going to put this on here. I'm just going to delete that for a second. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into preferences, and I'm going to turn off the auto warp long samples. And let's drag it in now and see what happens. That did not do it. I think what the problem is, it's picked up the settings from before. So you do find that with some tracks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find a track from the Finder and drag it into the project. Bear with me a sec. I've got some in some downloads, got a few tracks. Let's try a different track. Let's try this one. I'm going to drag that one, and you can drag it straight from the Finder into the arrangement, and hopefully I've turned it off. Ah, that's better. So let's play this track and see how that one maps up. You can hear the tempo is completely going out. It's not automatically warped it for us, and you can see at the beginning of the file it's not put any warp markers there, so you've got this gap at the beginning, so it's not going to line up with the project. So that's a really good feature, like auto warp. You've got to switch it on, so they'll go in, and then like you saw that it analysed the whole file, and then it's going to switch on auto warp, and it's pretty good at guessing like all the transients and getting it like bang in time. So the remainder of this section will focus on various ways of guiding live's auto warping, because sometimes it doesn't always do quite what you want. Even with songs that are digitally produced that are all bang on the same tempo, there could be some bits in it that cause it to sort of some funny intros or stuff that cause it not to line up properly. So it's good to know like both ways of doing it. So let's have a look at manually warping longer pieces of audio. So sometimes the metronome can be handy when you're doing this, which you know where that is at the top. So like I was saying, sometimes the auto warp might not get the downbeat right. So let's just put the warp on like that. So there we go, I put warp on. So the downbeat is the first beat. Now I've put auto warp on now, and it's not put the warp on the first downbeat, it's put it here. So it thinks that is bar 1. So what we can do is, like we did before, we can either double click on it like that, and then we can like hit, if we hold down shift, we've got to delete this marker again. What we can do is we can drag that back to bar 1 to get it on, sorry. Let's hold shift and drag that back to, sorry, I've done it again. I've got to put the beat on bar 1. I've done it the wrong bit. Sorry, I'm trying. What you could do is drag it back to bar 1 like that. That was one way. Sorry. What I was trying to show you is when you've got the marker here. Let's take that one off. If you hold down like the shift key, you could then drag that across to line that up with the first beat. So that's like a more of a manual way of doing it. And this could be useful for different types of audio, like especially if you're doing like vinyl sort of recordings. So that's one way of doing it. Let's just go back a couple of steps. like that to where we was at the beginning. So the other way is doing it is, which is what I've told you. You can double click on it and then just drag it back to bar 1, or if you just right click on it, you can actually go set 1.1.1 here, and that will start it from the beginning like that. But sometimes you just got to move the little loop thing to match up with it as well. So that's lined it up with bar 1, but it hasn't warped the sample. So then we want to have a look at how do we want to direct our auto warp. So the directing the auto warp is relatively simple when you've like imported a perfectly sort of like cut loop, or you've got a well like digitally produced track which is in time. So to do that, you could just right click on here, and then you've got these warp settings here. You've got like warp from here start at 1:25 p.m, warp from here straight. We'll have a quick look into these different settings here. You could hit like warp from here, and that should get it in time. So let's have a listen to that. So that works pretty good for like tracks that are digitally produced and the tempo's all the way through. So you can also use warp BPM from here. So let's have a look at that. And obviously it depends on what BPM you've got on the track. Let's just zoom right out of this. If we right click on here, and you can go warp from here, and you got warp 125 BPM from here. That will warp it the same sort of way, but you can see like now it's made it go completely out of time. So with warp like that setting, what it's doing, it's setting a single warp marker, but in this case the auto warp is forced to interpret the clip as exactly matching the live set's tempo. So it can be useful in cases we happen to know the exact BPM value of an electronic produced track, but what you'd have to do is you'd have to type it into the control bar before working, because you can see it's 128 BPM here. Now I've right clicked on here, and then I've gone warp 125 BPM from here, so that's why it's gone out. It's not quite gone properly. So if I take that up to 128 like that and get the project's tempo first, and I know that the track is 128, then I can then right click here and go warp 128 BPM from here, and that should get it in time. So yeah, there's a couple of different settings to think about. The warp from here is a good one, just warps it straight to the project's tempo, as long as it's like a good clean recording where it's like dead in time, probably like a more digital recording from rather than a vinyl recording. It's going to do it pretty well. So you can do that, and then if you want to warp it and you know the tempo of the track already by looking at this section down here, then just make sure you set the tempo up here and then hit the warp from like warp 128 BPM from here. So if you was doing it with vinyl, it's a slightly different affair, because when you record a vinyl recording in, let's just mute this one out and put this one on, you don't necessarily know the actual tempo of the vinyl. You might do, but you might not. Depends on what mixer you've got, or some do show you the BPM. And it all depends on what Live's interpretation of the BPM is like being analysed as. It says it's 131 BPM. It could well be 131 BPM. So what you would do then is you could actually turn the warp off. So with the vinyl recording, what I would do is hit the warp button on, and then I'd right click and go warp from here, and then you can see I've accidentally pressed the tempo down here. Let's turn it up a little bit. Let's see how well it's picked it up. Not too bad. But sometimes what you'll find with vinyl is as you're going through the track, it starts to drift out. You can see here like the warp markers aren't keeping dead on the grid. So then what it's a case of is it's sometimes you have to go through and then manually like warp it section by section. So you can, depends on how far you want to go. You can do like a 4-bar loops, you could do it by one loop, but it can take a bit of time. So then what you could do is you could just double click here, and then you can start like working through each section of the track. So if I click on this loop brace here, and then what I would do is put a marker here and warp it to this bar here, bar 5. So that whole section there is pretty tight. And then what I do is usually select the loop brace, press the up arrow and move across to the next section, and then see how this one loops up. Again, go to the end of here and you can see it's drifting off a bit already, and you can go like that, move that across. So yeah, with vinyl it can be a little bit more tricky, and yeah, sometimes you can go like that. Sometimes you can get away with going through at the beginning sort of sections of the vinyl track, is going into like 16 32 bar sections and getting those synced up, and then like going like that, selecting the loop, hitting the up arrow, go doing the next section from here, and again you can start playback by just, and then go into the end of here, and you can start seeing like things are drifting off a little bit here and there. So it's just going through and manually getting things in time so it sort of gets going. So yeah, vinyl could be a little bit tricky if you're recording vinyl tracks in and you want to get them to fit in with your DJ sets. Let me just have a quick swig of drink for 5 minutes. 5 seconds. Lovely. So let's have a look at quantizing audio, because we've done some warping manually. So I'm just going to delete that track, these two sections, these two tracks out of here. Let's get back to our loops. Let's get some stuff on like that. Let's get the metronome off. Now this is great because you can like start dragging in loads of audio files from a sample pack. Do you know what I mean? You've got drum loops, you could drag in a bass loop. You could start dragging in all these loops and they're going to go pretty much in time. But what you can do is, like, you can actually quantize the audio file, so it locks in like time with, like, you might have a quantize setting that you use on the rest of your track, and this could be a really good way of just locking it in. So to quantize it, at the moment you can see like the markers or the pseudo warp markers, they're slightly off the beat. Now for a bass line this might be quite good because it's giving a bit of a groove, but for a drum loop you might want to quantize it so it's a bit tighter. I mean, this one you can see it's bang on, like the loop's pretty tight already. But sometimes when you record some sort of loops in from drum machines or other stuff, you might want to quantize them so they're dead in time. So to do that, you could just right click in here and find your quantize setting, or command U, and you can see it puts warp markers in, and it's going to quantize it to every 16th note. And if I do it on this one, if I right click on here and go quantize, sorry, right click in here, if I go to the quantize settings like that, you can see that it's quantizing to the current grid. Now the current grid down here is set to 1/16. Now you could change it to anything. You could change it to 8th notes like that, and if I clicked OK, it's going to quantize all those. So it's going to give it a completely different feel. So yeah, this is a really good feature to use to get things locked in. If you've got, maybe not so much with stuff like I'm using at the moment that you've got from sample packs, but if you dragged in like a loop that was from, I don't know, say like a different style of music, like a jazz loop or something like that, and you wanted to get it locked in, maybe the drums were a little bit out of time. If you just quantize it to 16th note or to whatever quantize settings you use for your track, it's just going to lock all those audio files in. And I'll probably show you a bit more of this when we get into the next videos, like next week, when I start showing you like some MIDI editing, and then I can show you how to then add audio loops and then lock everything in together using some quantize and groove settings. find some different. Let's try this percussion. So you can drag this percussion loop in. Again, right click, quantize. So at the moment it's 1/8 notes, but I'm probably going to want to quantize it to 16th notes. So what you do is you set the grid here first of your loop, and then you right click, quantize to 16th notes. Here we go, like that, and then but as you can see, it's not quite worked on this loop because this loop is got a bit more of a groove on it. So quantizing things dead on the 16th note can make it sound quite robotic. So what I will do, like in the next session, I'll show you how to use the groove settings, so you can then lock it in a bit more using some of these really cool groove settings we've got in Ableton. Because at the moment this sounds actually better without the quantize on, because it's got a groove already on there. So yeah, we'll get into that. But like you can, this is a really good way to start like putting some tracks together. You can like use loops to start with. There's nothing wrong with it, and I still do use some loops when I make tracks now. It's just finding a sample pack from an artist that you like, and then you'll find that or a style of music that you like, and then when you find that when you're learning to put stuff together, if you've got the actual right artist or the right label with the right style of music sample pack to use, you'll find that when you start putting just a few basic ideas together, they're going to sound a lot better, rather than trying to find all the samples that you want from Ableton's menu, because it's probably got a mix of about 1 million different like styles and genres in there. So you've just got a mishmash of stuff. Now this can be good sometimes, but my recommendation is to find a really good. I got this off of Sample Market by East End Dubs. Really good artist, and yeah, I find it easier to find a sample pack of something you like and then just go with that. And I know I've said this before, but I just want to just keep like hammering it home. So next thing we'll have a look at is the different adjustments on the audio files, using to get the warp stretching quality right for the right type of sample. So if you see here, you've got these different like settings here. You've got beats, tones, texture, repitch, complex, and complex pro. Well, beats is pretty self-explanatory, and I have this set in preferences to like default warp mode is beats. So beats mode works best for material where like rhythm is dominant, e.g. you've got drum loops as well as most pieces of electronic dance music. The granulation process is optimized to preserve the transients, so it's going to make the transients in the beats like really sharp, and then you can use some of the other settings to get a bit more deeper into it. I'm not going to go over these all now because like as a beginner I don't want to overload you with too much information. This is a bit more like when you've started to get a bit more in depth into Ableton, but for now like I just want to touch on what each mode does. So that is the beats mode. So the next one is called tones mode. Now I would use the tones mode because it's good for stretching material with a more or less clear pitch structure, such as things like vocals or monophonic instruments and bass line. Now monophonic instruments are things that only play one note at a time. So when you're singing a song, or a vocalist sings on their own, they're only going to be able to sing one note at a time. Or when you're playing a bass line, you're pretty much going to be playing one note at a time. It's only when you start getting into playing chords and stuff you're going to play more than one note at a time. So for things like this bass line, you could change this to tones and it's just going to be a better setting for that type of sound. And I do find a lot of people slip up on this, because if you've got beats set to everything and then you try and do adding in like full tracks, sometimes it doesn't sound quite right. So the next one we've got is called texture. So this works well for sound textures with like an ambiguous pitch. So like I was saying, polyphonic orchestral music, it could be pads. Like I was saying, it could be like a really good way of using for manipulating all kinds of sounds in a creative way. So this would probably work better for things like if you was using chords or stuff like that. So you could change it to texture. I haven't got anything at the moment, but you sort of get the gist of it. You could go into, let's have a look what we got. We've got some musical elements here. What we got? Chord. So if I drag that one in, just make that a bit shorter. So yeah, you could change that to texture, and then that's. You're not going to necessarily hear it instantly because it's quite hard to sort of like hear the changes, but like Ableton's done this for a reason, to make the overall sound quality of each type of sound better using these different types of modes. So it's something to be really aware of. Another one we've got is called repitch mode here. So in repitch mode, Live doesn't really stretch or compress the music. Instead, it just adjusts the playback rate to create the desired amount of stretching. So in other words, to speed up a playback by a factor of 2, it's transposed up an octave. So this is like a DJ stretching method of using a variable speed turntables to sync two records. So yeah, maybe might want to use that if you're using full track. Sometimes could be useful for like some types of vinyl and stuff. A bit more for creative sort of settings. And then the next one we've got is called complex mode. So complex mode's a warping method, like it's used to, like, probably used for more advanced sort of full composite signals, like things like entire songs that like contain beats, like tones and like textures, like something that's got like a lot of information in it. The only problem with it is it's quite CPU intensive, and it uses can use 10 times as much of the CPU resources required by the other warp mode. And this is why it's important to make sure that you're using the right warp mode for the right type of music. You wouldn't want to use complex on everything, because if it's using 10 times as much CPU, then like by the time you put a whole track together, you're going to be like eating up a lot of CPU power that you don't need to, just by like using like the wrong warp setting. But yeah, something to think about. And then also you've got Complex Pro, so it's just like complex but a little bit more like, yeah, it's just a little bit better than that. So it's the next one up. So this can work well with like I said, like polyphonic textures, whole songs. So it's just like, again, it's just going to use more CPU than complex. So you just got to be very wary of these things. And there are ways of setting these on and then like doing stuff like freezing the tracks. So yeah, that's like, this is going like way in depth for a beginner type of stuff. But I just wanted you to be aware of these different settings and just sort of get used to beats, tones, textures, and probably the complex is probably the 4 to keep an eye on. I'd hold off for repitch for a minute and the Complex Pro, because again, you just use the ones that you're going to be using for the time being until you need to get to the point where you need to use those other ones. So that's it. We went over warping, we went over time warping samples, went over transients and pseudo warp markers, went over using warp markers for different types of audio. We looked at quantizing audio, and we looked at adjusting like the different modes just then. So if you've got any question, pop them in the comments, and then we'll answer them as soon as we can. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you